Alright, so let's talk about CSS layouts. So making layouts in CSS used to be this really awkward and annoying thing to do. You used to have to use all these janky hacks in order to make everything work. So you would use this weird percentage math, and you'd use floats and have to clear the floats, and it was just kind of a mess to get a really good layout just using CSS. But CSS has really progressed a lot through the past years, and we now have things like Flexbox and CSS Grid that really makes it a lot easier to make layouts in CSS. So today we're going to talk about Flexbox. Now, Flexbox is a really good way to make one-dimensional layouts. And by that I mean it's best used for making single rows and single columns and then laying things out inside those. So it's not as good for more complex layouts like grids. For that I would probably use CSS grids, and I'll probably make a video about that in the future. But for now, let me just show you what Flexbox can do. So Flexbox is really useful for making simpler layouts and things like navigation bars. And another nice thing about Flexbox is that it's pretty widely supported. So this is not some new bleeding edge technology that's going to break every old browser. It's supported in every modern browser, and even partial support for Internet Explorer. Now, if you really want to make your website work on Internet Explorer, I still test it on that, just because some things work a little bit differently in Internet Explorer than the more modern browsers. But it has really good support, so there's really no disadvantages to using it. Alright, so let's start out with a basic layout. So with this, I just have a div called Flexbox and 3 items inside it with Flexbox item as the class. Now, I haven't done any additional styling besides just make it look nice. So we can start by making this a Flexbox by using display flex on the parent. We save that, and now everything is in one line here, and the height is 100% of its parent. So we can do flex in 2 different directions. We can do it horizontally, or we can also change the direction with flex direction. And we can change that to column, save that, and now it's going vertically. So the default of flex direction is row, and that gives us the default layout right here. So yeah, we can have it on the x-axis or the y-axis. And in addition to that, I don't really use these too often, but you can also use the reverse of these as well. So we can use row reverse. And as you can see, it's starting from the right side, and it's displaying the 3rd item first, the 2nd item second, and the 1st item last. But these are all in the same order in the HTML, but CSS Flexbox can just display it in the opposite order. And of course, the column reverse is going to be the exact same thing, but vertically, as you can imagine. Alright, so let's just leave it at the default for now, the flex direction row. And one of the most useful things you can do in Flexbox is align everything and center everything really nicely. One of the best parts about Flexbox is you have a lot of control over how you want all your items to be aligned. So what I can do is use justify content, and justify content will affect everything on the main axis. So if your flex direction is row, then it'll affect everything on the x-axis. And if it's column, it'll affect everything on the y-axis. So let's say we want to center everything. Center all of these items, and then now they're in the center of this div. We also have a lot of other options, like we can say flex start. That'll give you the default where everything is over here. We can also do flex end, where everything is at the end over here. And we have a few other nice options like space between. And this will space everything out evenly with the space in between. We can also do space around if you also want to have space around at the end like this. So now we have equal gaps between all of these. So that's a lot of useful things you can do with justify content to align these horizontally. The next thing you can do is work with the y-axis. So you can also position these with the opposite axis. And so since this is a row, this is going to be the y-axis. If this was displayed as a column, then it would be the x-axis. So let's say align items, and then we have a lot of the same options that we do in justify content. So we can say align items center, and then all of these are going to be displayed in the center. So the default for this is stretch, which is just going to stretch it across the entire height of the container. But yeah, we also have the center, which is really nice because vertically centering things in CSS used to be a major headache with a ton of hacks that you'd use to get around it. But Flexbox makes it extremely easy just to vertically center something like this. And of course, in addition to this, we also have the flex start and the flex end. As you can imagine, it's the same as the justify content. And the last thing here you can do is baseline. So this is going to align everything along the bottom of this text right here. So if you have, for example, different size text, like one text is larger than the other, then this will align it along the baseline of the text, so that all this text is even right here. Here, let me show you how it works. If we make one of these a bit larger than the other, say font size 40 pixels. And as you can see, it is now centered along the baseline right here. So these all have the same baseline. Okay, so that's align items for you. Next, let's talk about flex wrap. So by default, these are not going to wrap. These are all going to be on one line. And even if I make the width something like 50%, they won't all actually take up 50%. Flexbox will kind of constrain them so they can't break onto two different lines. So instead of actually 50%, Flexbox kind of compresses it into about 30%, just because it can't wrap onto a new line. But with flex wrap, you can change that. So there's two options, no wrap, which is the default, and wrap. So if flex can wrap, then you see these will take up the actual size of the element, the width 50%. So these are now all 50%, and since this can't fit on one line, then it pushes this onto the next line. So that's useful if you want to create some multi-dimensional layouts, if you want to have a bit of columns. But like I said, if you want to make more complex grid-based layouts, then Flexbox isn't the best tool to do this, but it's nice to have flex wrap for some more simpler things like this. Okay, so next let's talk about align content. So align content is similar to align items in that it'll work along the opposite axes, but align content only works if there are multiple rows. So this will only work if you have flex wrap and you have multiple rows. So align content takes in the same things that align items would do, but it's for centering multi-line layouts like this. So we can have all of these rows go to the center. We can have it do flex start and flex end, like you can imagine. So that's useful if you have a multi-column layout. But for now, let's just delete all this. I don't want them to wrap. And let's remove this for now. Okay, so that's how you work with the parent component right here. And that's how you can lay out all those and align those how you'd like. But as you can see, these don't take up the entire width of the container. So what we can do to these individual items is we can add the flex grow property. So flex grow will tell these Flexbox items to take up the available space that we have here. So if we set flex grow to 1, then all of these will take up an equal amount of the empty space right here. So as you can see, these are now all filled. And so this 1 value here, this is like in proportion to the other. So 1 means that they all take up the same space as one another. But you can also give 1 a bit more of the free space than the other ones. Like let's say we want the first one to get a little bit more than the other ones. So the other ones are taking up an equal share of the free space, but we want the first child to get double the amount of free space that the other ones do. So now this is taking up a little bit more because it's getting double the amount of free space. We can also change this to more. If we wanted to have 4 times the amount of free space that these other ones do, now it's getting a lot more space than the other ones. And you can kind of mix and match these a little bit. Let's say we want the last one to get a bit more than the other one. We can say the last child will grow, let's say it'll get twice the amount of space than the middle one. So now this one gets twice the amount of space, and this time one gets 4 times the amount of the free space that this one gets. Okay, let's delete all the flex grows for now. You can also set the default of how much space that these take up with the flex basis. So let's say we give them all 50%, or let's say we give them all 25% of the available space, and now they're each taking up 25%. And if you do this with flex direction column, so they'll each take up 25% of the height now. So that's a little bit different than just something like width or height. So this will take up 25% of the x-axis if the flex direction is row, and it'll take up 25% of the y-axis if the flex direction is column. And of course, it's the same with the width. So if they take up 50% and you don't have the flex wrap on, then it'll just take up as much space as it can get its hands on. Okay, so let's say we want each of these to be 50%, but there's not really enough space for each of them to get 50%. So what you can do is you can use flex shrink. And flex shrink is the opposite of flex grow, as you can imagine. So flex shrink will say, okay, if there's not enough space for all of these, then we want this one to shrink by 3 times as much as the other ones. So the default of this one is 1. And so each one shrinks to the value of 1. So they all shrink the same way. As you can see, they each get a fair share. But if we want this one to shrink 3 times as much as the other ones, then see, these are going to take up the remaining space because they all want to be 50%, but this one is going to be a little bit generous and give up its space to the other ones because it has flex shrink on it. I don't really use flex shrink as much. Most of the time I'm just going to use flex grow, but that's useful to have. And if you don't want to type all this out, this flex grow, flex basis, flex shrink, there is a shorthand property right here that you can use. It's called flex. So flex, the first value is going to be the flex grow value. So by default that's 0, but we can make it 1. And then the flex shrink property is going to be by default 1, so let's just leave it as that. And then the last one is the flex basis property. So we can say something like we want it to be 35%. And then that is the same as writing flex grow 1, flex shrink 1, and then flex basis 35%. It's just an easier way to write all that. And if you just want to use the flex grow, I don't really touch flex shrink that often, and sometimes I don't use flex basis. So if you want it even shorter, you can just write flex 1, and that just means flex grow 1 for all of these. Same with this, flex 2 means flex grow 2, so this will take up twice the amount of free space that the other ones will. Now you can also individually align these. Like say that we want to, I already went over the align items to center, but maybe we don't want all of them to be in the center, maybe we just want one of them to be in the center. So what we can do is we can use align self. So just the first one is going to be affected. I'm going to push center, and as you can see, just the first one is centered, all the other ones are the exact same. And of course this will take in any value that align items will. So you can also set this to flex end or flex start, and that'll be positioned appropriately. Finally, we can change the order of the flex items with the order property. So we can set the order, the default order for all of these is 0. So that basically means put these in the order that they're laid out in the HTML. But if we want, we can make the first one, we can make the first child higher than 0. We can set it to 1. And so then the first item is going to be all the way in the back. This also works with negative numbers. So let's say we want the last child to be first. So we'll set that to -1. So then the third one is going to be in the front. And you can basically order these however you want, which is pretty useful when you're setting up a mobile layout. Maybe you want your layout to be different on mobile than on desktop, and you can reposition things on the fly with Flexbox so that you can rearrange the order once it gets to a smaller screen. So I actually use that a lot. It's pretty useful. And that's basically all there is to Flexbox. Now, I get when you first learn Flexbox, okay, this is a lot to handle, this is a lot to remember, and it's kind of hard to imagine, okay, how do I set up an actual layout using this? So I'll give you an example with something I actually use Flexbox on a lot, which is the navigation bar. I think Flexbox is the best way to set up a navigation bar because it's a one-dimensional layout. It just goes in one direction, and we need to kind of position things in different ways. Alright, so let me uncomment out this header right here, and let me remove this Flexbox for now. Alright, so we now have a navigation right here, and this is just a basic navigation, there's nothing to it, but let's see if we can put these items to the right, and then let's also see if we can make it responsive. So these items will be on the right, but whenever you go to a mobile phone, I want it to be just in one column, like this. So let's see if we can do this with Flexbox. It's actually pretty easy. So this is just a header. Let's see the HTML. It's just header with the class of header, and then a div with the logo inside it, and that's my new site. And then we have an unordered list of the navigation right here. Alright, so let me clear this out. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we'll make the header a Flexbox so that these are shown in a row instead of this column. So let me say .header display flex. Alright, so the header is now a Flexbox and the default is a row, so these are going to be side by side instead of vertically. Alright, we also want to have these unordered list items to be side by side or flex direction row. So we're also going to make this navigation list right here a Flexbox as well. You can have Flexboxes inside Flexboxes. Who knew? So let's say .nav display.flex as well. Oh wait, this is supposed to be .nav. My bad. Alright, so these are now positioned correctly. Let's also give these some padding just so it looks alright. Let's say all anchor tags will have a padding of 10 pixels. Okay, but these are not really positioned correctly. Like this is way higher than this is. So I want to make these all vertically aligned in the same way. So what we can do is we can set the header to be align items. So this is everything on the y-axis. We want that all to be center. And so these are now all in the center. If we also want to align these along the text, we could also do baseline. That works as well. This would work better if these were different sizes of text, like maybe the logo is a bit bigger than these. So this sets them all along the baseline. Alright, so we now have the logo here next to the navigation, but I want the navigation to fill up the entire rest of the empty space right here. We don't need the logo to grow because it can just stay right here, but we need the navigation to grow because we want to fill this entire rest of the space with the navigation. So let's put in this .nav, let's say flex grow is 1, and then see now this is taking up the remainder of the empty space right here. Now we want to put this navigation at the end right here instead of right here at the beginning. So we can do that with justify content. So this is a Flexbox, and so we want to put everything on the x-axis to the end of it. So we can do that with justify content is equal to flex end, and then this will put everything on the end right here. Alright, so that's a nice basic navigation, but I also told you I wanted to make this responsive. So if we make this responsive, maybe if we have more items here in the future, then it's going to kind of break the layout a little bit. Like there's too many things. So instead I'd like to make this a column. So we can do that with media queries. So let's say at media max width is equal to 400 pixels. And inside this, let's change the header and also the navigation to flex direction column. So this will put everything in a column instead of as a row. Save that, and now everything is in a column, but the layout is still a little bit messed up because see, previously we set align items to center, but since we're now on flex direction column, the y-axis, align items is now affecting the x-axis. So it's putting everything to the center right here. So in order to change that, we have to change align items to flex start. And that'll put everything over here. Alright, perfect, that's what we want. You could probably make this a little bit prettier, but as you can see, it's a column layout on mobile, and on desktop is now in one row like I wanted it. Alright, so that's a pretty basic use case for Flexbox, but it's a use case that I use all the time. And honestly, for simpler websites, like maybe something you do with this, I use Flexbox pretty much exclusively. I only use something more complicated if I'm actually using a more complicated layout with a whole bunch of grids and different size columns, different size rows. But for Flexbox, it'll get you through most of what you need. So in my opinion, it's a whole lot better than working with floats or these weird margin percentages like we used to have to do with CSS. And once you get good at this, it might seem a little bit confusing now, but I challenge you to build some basic layouts in Flexbox, or maybe try to convert one of your websites over to a Flexbox, and it'll all start to make sense really soon. You'll probably have to start off with a cheat sheet, like this one I recommend here, and it kind of goes over everything that I talked about as a reference guide if you want to look it up. So once you make a few layouts with Flexbox and you go over the reference guide, it'll all click and Flexbox will make a lot of sense. And honestly, you're not really going to be using anything else for most of the things. Alright, so if you want to see some more complex layouts using something like CSS Grid, I'll probably cover that in the next video or very shortly, so stay tuned.